All right, without further ado, here is Dr. Laing.
Thank you, and hello everybody, and hello everybody who is at home and joining us on Teams. It's really cool to be back in person, talking to real people, so thank you all for coming along. This is a real treat, because, you know, you're... As I said, I recently passed the Viva, and I would like to extend my thanks to Colin and Joe, who have very patiently supervised me over a number of years, and also to Alice, who was the internal examiner, who didn't laugh at me during the Viva, which was a great relief. So here I am. So this evening I am going to talk to you about the results of some of my PhD research, which overall kind of explored ways in which we can understand something of what it was like to be a child during prehistory. As we know, children are now more frequently the topic of research. For a long time in prehistory, you would think that there were no children, and indeed for a long time there were no women. But things have changed, and we now realise that there were children in prehistory and that they are worthy of studying. But with prehistory, for Bronze and Iron Age Britain, which is what I've looked at, there's not that much in the way of anthropomorphic representation, and what there is doesn't feature children. We're kind of looking for sort of glimpses of what it was like and looking for that evidence. So that evidence is really quite hard to come by. So occasionally we get suggestions of something that might have been toys. There was a suggestion recently that there was a little kind of a hedgehog figure found somewhere near Stonehenge that might have been a toy. But then, frankly, anything in the hands of a child can be a toy. They can have a stick, or they can have a stone, or they can have something. And there's also that big issue of whether something that's small and could be used by a child could also be a miniature votive object or something like that. So, you know, the toy thing is all one of those things that never quite gets resolved. Also, we have ethnographic analogies of what it would be like and what children got up to in societies that we use to compare with prehistoric societies. Of course, we have burial evidence. Did look at burial evidence, but of course you have that problem that a child and how their body is represented in the funerary sphere may not necessarily be how they were treated or what their life experiences were like. And obviously the ones that we find, they're the ones that didn't make it. So it's quite difficult to make that direct correlation between burial data and the experience of being young. So what I wanted to look at was whether we could find any sort of tangible evidence of what children got up to, the ones that were not dead. So I took the approach of examining fingertips and fingerprints, two distinct things, or fingertip impressions and fingerprints, which had been left on pottery during the Bronze and Iron Age, and trying to find out whether they could shed any light on whether children were involved in pottery production. So I'm afraid the first part of this talk has nothing to do with archaeology at all, and rather I'm going to take you through the slightly murky and how they can be used for exploring aspects of past activities. So fingerprints to start with. You're going to all know that we have little ridges on our fingertips. They are known as epidermal ridges because they are ridges in the epidermis of the skin. You also have them on the palms of your hands, and if you're feeling acrobatic later, you have them on the soles of your feet and your toes. Although obviously it's fingerprints rather than palm prints and toe prints, which are most well known through their association with forensics and crime detection. And we do find them on archaeological artefacts, otherwise my PhD would have been a lot shorter. Because clay is a plastic medium before it dries and is fired, you get impressions preserved occasionally of the fingerprints made when the potter was shaping the clay. So at the top, the one that's in the middle up there, that's one of the recently publicised ones from Orkney, Neolithic fingerprint. It was one that is supposedly of an adult male. There's another one that's been publicised recently that has been suggested was a 13-year-old boy. I'm not entirely convinced one can be quite so specific with fingerprints, but I'll tell you about that in a moment. At the bottom here, we've got various shots of the inside of a Roman oil lamp. And the image at the top is a medieval wax seal. So wax also being sort of a plastic medium will preserve prints, and there was a rather cool project at Lincoln University that looked at fingerprints on wax seals a few years ago. You also get them in other substances. It's been reported that there is a fingerprint in a tub of Roman face cream somewhere, so that would be a one to have a look at. So for a long time, fingerprints have been classified and classed according to pattern. So we have whorls and arches and loops, and then those are further subdivided into ulnar and radial alignment, so whether your loops lean this way or that way, so inwards and outwards. And then as well as those kind of big overarching patterns, you have what's known as minutiae. So those are the micro features of your fingerprints. And those are the things which give each print its individuality. So minutiae include things like epidermal, deviating, random little dots in amongst the pattern of lines on your fingertips. And they're really hard to see with the naked eye, but those form the fundamental basis of fingerprint identification work. And these days, there's kind of really clever computer programs that will map the patterns and match them to prints found at a crime scene, to individuals who happen to be in the police database. And with this in archaeology, that some work has been done trying to match prints of individual potters from ceramics on specific workshops, which has had some success. I was interested in a slightly bigger picture. So who were the potters in prehistory? Was it men, women or children, or a combination thereof? And so the question I wanted to answer was whether we can get sort of broad demographic information from fingerprints rather than a specific person, which given prehistory and the scale of it is quite tricky. So with regards to these epidermal ridges, patterns develop in utero on a developing baby. And once it's formed, that pattern doesn't change. So epidermal ridges will increase in breadth rather than number as you age and as the bones in your fingers grow. So in essence, ridge breadth increases with age throughout childhood and early adolescence, which means that it's possible to assign a broad age group to the maker of a print based on the measurement of the breadth of that epidermal ridge. So I'm going to explain my methods briefly for creating a framework for interpreting prints and impressions, and then I'm going to show you some results. So I'm afraid there are some graphs coming up in a moment, so do bear with me whilst I take you through a little bit about methods. So we do know from forensic studies on modern populations that within a given geographical population, there's clear adult sexual dimorphism in epidermal ridge breadth. So broadly speaking, adult men have wider epidermal ridges than adult women. Part of that is probably due to men being taller and generally a bit larger than women. But even if you discount stature or body size, then there is a proven difference between ridges of adult men and women in terms of the breadth of the things. And there are an absolute raft of studies out there that have looked at this on various discrete modern populations. So these ridge dimensions amongst adults will vary depending on the geographic location of the population being studied. So, for example, prints from Chinese individuals will differ from those in sub-Saharan Africa, which are different again from South American prints, which differ again from European prints. So in order to get the basic demographic data from a print, you need to know from which geographical population it has come. And then for the purpose of interpreting them on archaeological artifacts, you're going to need a geographically broadly relevant data set against which to measure your archaeological prints. So we know that people are, I think, little point in comparing, say, Bronze Age fingerprints from Norfolk with fingerprints from Brazil or something. I think you need a slightly more geographically specific reference data set. So if that's what you're after, and there isn't any published data on children's epidermal ridges, and you happen to be doing a PhD on children, then you have to create your own reference data set, which is what I did. So I collected inked prints from 260 people. Aged from around 4 up until people in their 60s. I started at 4 because ethnographic studies have suggested that sort of 4 or 5 years old is when children start to get involved in doing useful things with pots. I used inked cellophane strips, which, if any of you have ever had to go and have yourself eliminated from police inquiries, it's the sort of thing where it's a piece of cellophane, you stick your fingers on, they get very inky, and then you put them onto paper, like you can see up there. I then scanned these things in Photoshop to measure over groups of lines on the inked print. So what you can see there with the red lines is a blown up version of a fingerprint that I've taken. Measuring perpendicularly over a group of lines, as many as possible, and then averaging them out. So the length of the line divided by the number of lines gives you that mean ridge breadth. And when doing that, it's best to avoid the minutiae that I just mentioned. So you can probably see in the middle towards the top of that print, there are bits where the ridges come to an end. There are some sort of random dots and deviations and things going on. You want to avoid those. You want a nice run of boringly straight ridges, and then you can work out the average ridge breadth from them. So with my reference data set, I took 2 measurements per digit, so that's 20 per individual, and then averaged them for each person for each 10 digits. Now, there is some variation between the ridge measurements on each digit, so thumbs are the widest and ring fingers are the narrowest. But when you're looking at a print on an archaeological artifact, you don't know which finger it's come from, or indeed whether it's come from a thumb. So working with averages allows you to build interpretive parameters. And then I've also recorded people's height, because previous studies suggested that there was a link between height and mean ridge breadth, and I did say there were graphs coming up, and here's the first of, there's only 2. So this is a reference collection of modern data, which shows us the link between age, which is in months here, and mean ridge breadth, MRB. And you should see that up until about 180 months-ish, which is about 15 years, then we've got a broad correlation between age and mean ridge breadth, and then after that it all gets a bit messy. But broadly speaking, as you get older, adult males have wider ridges or greater mean ridge breadth than females. Mentioned and plotted against mean ridge breadth, there's a clearer correlation, and I think in fact it's clearer than age. So just to check my accuracy of my heights with my sample group, I checked it against published height data from the National Institute of Clinical Excellence and the World Health Organization for both subadults and adults, and the height of my smallish sample of 260 people within published parameters. So I can say that my people are normal, at least within, as far as their height is concerned, and therefore I've got a usable reference sample that I can then build some parameters for comparing against archaeological prints. So we have the situation where I think height can be broadly predicted from ridge breadth, because you can just sort of draw your lines across. But to consider age estimates, you need to translate height into age using a knowledge of the height variability in the population you're studying. So in essence, people were a bit shorter in prehistory than we are now. And the modern data that forms the reference collection therefore needs a bit of rescaling so that it's more accurate for prehistoric populations. And it's the same if you could use this data and apply it to medieval populations or whatever you wanted. As long as you look at the height of the population that you're studying, the archaeological population, and rescale, then it does apply more widely than prehistory. But so considering stature in prehistoric periods needs to be done before I could develop interpretive parameters to apply that modern data set to archaeological samples. So when I brought together a few studies of stature in prehistory just to kind of work out how much to rescale things by. So looking at the Bronze Age material, they were about 4% shorter than we are now, and for the Iron Age it's about 6%. So a little different. For some reason they got a bit shorter in the Iron Age. I think the weather got worse and it made them shorter. But I've used those figures to rescale and mean heights from my participants in the study to provide a possible height profile for Bronze and Iron Age individuals, and then I can link that to mean ridge breadth to develop those parameters. And there's some studies, I mean, I'm not the first to do fingerprints on pots, so some existing studies have kind of looked at epidermal ridge breadth and come up with kind of regression equations that are working back from mean ridge breadth to allow you to pinpoint the age of the fingerprint owner. I think that is overstating the accuracy of the technique. So, for example, the one that recently was publicised from Orkney that said this is a 13-year-old boy, I think that's on the cusp of the really woolly bit in the middle, where adolescents and women, in terms of their fingerprint dimensions, all get there's a bit of an overlap. So I think the best we can do with it is parameters, and that's what I've got here. So we do have overlapping measurements, and also the pubertal growth spurt makes a bit of a muddle of things in the middle. So I think what you can do with it is you can get these sort of these age bandings, and you'll be able to see. I don't expect you to memorise this or even read it, but at the bottom and top end of the scale, it's clear what you're dealing with. You can tell adult male prints, you can tell children's prints, and you can broadly tell whether you've got a child under 7, a child under 8 or 9. There is an overlap in the middle with older children, teenagers and women. But the way the technique works is if I've got measure a print and its mean ridge breadth is 0.28 of a millimetre, then I can say that that came from someone under 130 centimetres. In age terms, that's someone aged 9 or under. So it's a sort of it's a stage working back process. So I'm using this sort of best guess of heights of subadults in the similar growth rates, and I'm not claiming any wider application for looking at kind of stature in prehistory other than just as a tool for interpreting fingerprints. The other question, once you've worked out your parameters, is how to interpret the prints that you're finding on archaeological artefacts themselves. Well, I've photographed them, as you can see here. There are conceivably other ways of doing it. You could use dental impression material to take an impression of the print and then measure it under a microscope. I think other techniques have looked at using RTI for it. These are a few pieces of brickage from Lincolnshire, of which I'll be showing you more later on. And I simply, it's a rather old school technique. I photograph the things next to some 1mm graph paper. Then that allows you to set the scale in Photoshop, and you can use your graph paper to set your scale and measure across the lines. So I'm using the same technique that I used with the inked prints on the archaeological artefacts to just simply measure perpendicularly across the line and take an average for each print, and then I can work out the age and very occasionally the gender of the or sex of the person who has made that print. And then the other thing that you need to account for is the fact that clay shrinks, and as it dries and is subsequently fired, it loses moisture and it shrinks. So you need to scale back up your prints that you find to account for that shrinkage before you can interpret them. So there are plenty of studies that will tell you how much clay shrinks, and it depends on its mineral content and the inclusions and all other sorts of exciting things. Lots of studies have come up with an average, and other fingerprint studies have said it's around 9, 12, or 5. But I've gone with 7.5% because it seems to be used by people who look at ancient fingerprints. So you scale your prints up, and then you can that made it. And then finger impressions. Now this is the sort of the second arm of the sticking fingers in clay research. So these are distinct from fingerprints, but you often find these indentations made by fingertips in pots, sometimes used as a decorative technique and sometimes just accidentally left there by the person who was forming the pot. So I've also developed some parameters for interpreting these and trying to work out who was leaving their little sticky finger marks in the clay. So these are just a few images of the pots I've studied on the slide, which I will be terrorising you with in more detail. And for this side of things, I combined data from various recent studies. Some of them were anatomical, because people, for some reason, study the widths of fingers, which is helpful. Another one, and the reason there's a small child's hand on a car window there, was a health and safety study looking at the point at which you need to automatically shut off a closing car window in the back to stop your children getting their fingertips stuck and crushed in the automatically closing window. So who knew that health and safety in car windows would actually be of use to archaeology? But it's turned out to be really quite helpful. And I've also used the data that was used by the people who studied those squiggly things on the screen. And those are the finger flutings in the sort of soft surface of clay, soft surface of cave walls made during the Paleolithic, and they were studied by Kevin Sharp and Leslie Van Gelder, who had did their own reference collection of fingertip widths, because these things are made by dragging 3 fingers across the surface of the cave walls to make those patterns. So bringing all those things together gives, again, broad parameters with which you can interpret fingertip impressions. Now, obviously, it's clearer probably than fingerprints that different sizes of You tend not to use your little fingers and you tend not to use your ring fingers as much. It tends to be thumbs and first two fingers that are used. And then again, with the parameters, you've got the overlap in the middle, but you can tell pretty broadly whether you've got young children, whether you've got sort of that really annoying group in the middle where we've got teenagers and adult women, or you've got men's fingers, and if they're really wide, they're thumbs. And when you're looking at these things on the surface of the clay, there's a few things that you need to check. You want impressions that are deep enough to preserve the full width of the fingertip. So not shallow impressions that preserve just part of it. Sometimes you get like fingers are sort of wiped over the surface of a pot to smooth it out, and you get a slightly concave impression there, but if it doesn't preserve the full width of the fingertip, it's not so much use. So you want something that's got an approximately semicircular cross-section to indicate that you've got that fingertip width preserved. And it's also really helpful if you can ascertain in which direction the finger was applied to the pot surface. So the ones over here, often you get fingernail impressions. So the ones on the bottom left of the screen, so you're looking at it, that's made by sort of a rolling action. So you roll your finger round and you can see the sort of those little vertical lines. Those are the fingernail impressions. So we know here that the fingernail is going horizontally if you look at that picture, and which dimension in that rough circle to measure. And likewise, if you find clay that has been slightly displaced, these little raised bosses that you can see on the other image there, you can see that the finger there has been applied. That's coming from right to left as you look at it. They're pushing down, they've displaced a bit of clay, so you know which bit to measure. So sort of largely right angles to the way in which the finger had been applied to the surface of the clay, and that gives you the width. And also, you need minimal pressure to leave a finger impression in wet, malleable clay. So if you really jam your finger in, you're going to puncture the vessel wall. But I did want to check that to make sure that you're not getting an artificially wide measurement, because of your fingertip. If you press it down on a hard surface, it will splay. But if you're pushing a finger into wet clay, it doesn't splay that much. But I did measure this with a few volunteers, and the increase in fingertip width is around about 2%. So it's not actually that significant, well, not at all significant. And then, of course, the final thing is that impressions up, you know which way you're measuring them, you rescale them up by about 7%, and then you try and work out whose fingers they might be. And you'd often come up with, well, this might be the thumb of a younger child, or the index finger of somebody older. But you can kind of get a steer as to who might be involved in making these things. So having done methods, I'm now going to show you some of the results of what I found. So I looked at 4 different types of pottery from different points during the Bronze and Iron Age. So starting with the early Bronze Age, broadly 2,500 BC to 1500, when it's the early part is often known as the beaker period, as you will probably all know, due to these glorious characteristic pots which arrived on the scene at the beginning of the period. And these the more commonly found ones are these beautifully decorated ones that you can see up there, where you get the impressed and the incised decoration. But they're no good if you want to measure fingertips. What you want is what's known as the rusticated beakers. The images on the bottom of the screen, they're not great images, but the rusticated beakers are your friends if you like fingertips in pots. And rustication describes techniques that are used on coarsewares which roughen the surface of the pot, including fingernail and fingertip impressions, but also pinching of the surface. Pinch surface is no good if you want to measure something. But bizarrely, most of these things come from domestic sites. So maybe they had a different meaning from the more commonly found beakers, which come from funerary sites. And because they come from domestic sites, the amount of material is comparatively small, as we've got fewer known domestic sites from the period. And they also have a biased geographical distribution. They're found in East Anglia, these things, and in central southern Britain. So this slide just shows the types of fingertip rustication that appear. Obviously, not all of these are measurable. I looked at material early Bronze Age rusticated beakers from 3 sites, which are shown there on the map. And I think that frankly, these shirts are very dull to look at, and believe me, I've got worse. These are some of the better ones. But these fingertip impressions are really narrow, and they are consistent with having been made by children, and surprisingly young ones. Around half the impressions were of children aged about 5 to 7 years old, somewhat older, and then the balance came from that really annoying middle group, which covers younger adolescents and adult women. But importantly, none were wide enough to have been made by adult men. So we've got a sort of women and children, if not making, certainly decorating these rusticated beakers at these domestic sites. And a move to cremation in urns, and we've got this what's known as the Deverell Rimbey type pottery. These pots that commonly appear in barrel and bucket and globular urn forms, but they are frequently decorated with impressions of fingertips, and occasionally get the application of these sort of raised cordons round the edge, which are sort of horizontal raised strips of clay which run around the vessel. And these things are big. So if you like big pots and big fingertip impressed pots, then I can offer you nothing further than the Ardley style urns, which are a kind of an eastern component of this Deverell Rimbey bucket urn tradition. They come from Essex and Suffolk, and they are characterised by profuse fingertip decoration and occasional horseshoe-shaped cordons applied to the upper part of the pots, which possibly skeuomorphic representations of rope handles, hard to know, but they're rather groovy. And sometimes you get like a seemingly random pattern of impressions, which you can see on the top left there. Sometimes you get linears, sometimes you get these raised cordons. But these urns are well finished. The surfaces are often white, so very sadly no fingerprints, but many, many finger impressions. So I measured over 600 Ardley itself, Whitescarn and Brightlingsea, all of which are in Essex. And some of these urns show differential skill levels, which I thought was interesting. So this pot down here on the bottom left is upside down, because a lot of these were buried inverted, so they've lost their bases, so they're stored upside down in Colchester. So what's at the bottom of the screen would be the top of the pot. But here we've got quite reasonably applied vertical neat lines on what's, if you look under it, is the bottom underneath the cord. And on the other side of it, there's an attempt at vertical lines, but less accomplished, not so much. And the results with these finger impressions are consistent with this decoration of these urns having been carried out again by women and children, and again these youngsters as young as 5, and older kids as well. Again, there are no this sort of continuation from the information that's coming out of the early Bronze Age. I measured a lot more Middle Bronze Age fingertips because these things are abundant, but it was a very similar picture to the early Bronze Age. And in 8 instances on my pot, so I had 31 pots and 600 impressions, we've got this idea of 2 people working together on it. So if you look at the one with the horseshoe handle on, the impressions on the handle, or the sort of, it's not handle, but you know, the horseshoe-shaped thing that looks like a handle, are large. Those are older child or adult woman. The ones that are on the surface of the pot, sort of in between in the middle of the handle and around and behind it. So you get this sort of picture emerging of children participating in pot decorating, perhaps under the guidance of an older person. What I think is rather nice is that they're slightly wonky handiwork, and they're learning, and they're evidence of, you know, decorating these pots. It's not smoothed over and kind of redone. It's fired into the pot, and it's therefore presumably of some value to the community. And if you think of how we tend to treat our own kids, sort of things that they come home from school, isn't that lovely, dear? And you put it on the fridge and you wonder when you can get rid of it and you never want to see it again. Here, we've got children sticking their fingers in pots, and they're fired into the surface of the clay. And these things are big, you know, these are, you know, 40 centimetre diameter, I think garden bucket size. So it's unlikely that a child of about 7 is going to be able to create something of that size on their own. They would have to understand the structural stability principles. I mean, there's the weight of the thing as well. But it looks like kids are becoming sort of what would be termed legitimate peripheral participants within a community of practice, alongside older children and adolescent women, to form these communities of practice. And this is an idea of the community of practice idea comes from sociology. It's a group of people united by a concern or an interest or a craft, and who sort of share and deepen knowledge of it over time by continued interaction. So they're building a sort of a body of knowledge. And in the context of this research, communities of practice would be social networks in which potters are sharing a technological tradition, as exemplified by typology. So those manufacturing geographically and temporally specific pottery styles, but children are being brought into those communities pretty early on. And these are possibly the most boring potsherds I have ever seen, but there they are. This is from a site called Billingborough, which is in Lincolnshire. It's an occupation site rather than funerary, so it's still this Deverell Rimbri tradition of pottery, but domestic rather than funerary, and pots are smaller. But it's the same in picture. None of the fingertip impressions are from adult men. Again, they're being applied by women and children. And the base that you can see on the right of the screen there has got some impressions preserved in the bottom of it from when the pot was flattened as part of the manufacturing process. I can't age those ones beyond them being from someone over 7 years old. I mean, it doesn't show particularly well on the screen, but it's somebody who's pushed 3 fingers together repeatedly sort of to flatten the pot. But they are too narrow to be from men. So again, although I've been mainly looking at decoration, it does suggest that the pots are being manufactured by women and children as well as part of that same process. I then need to kind of jump forward. It doesn't have any fingertip decorated pots, or not in enough numbers to make it worthwhile to look at, and reach the Iron Age. So this is pottery type number 3, looking at early and middle Iron Age assemblages, where again we've got this picture of continuity in the communities of the potters. So during the Iron Age we get these regional pottery styles, or Cunliffe style zones, appearing. My study area was the east of England, and within that we've got various pottery types, so West Holling Fengate group in East Anglia, Ivanhoe Sandy in the Chilterns, and Staple Howe up in Yorkshire. And I looked at 5 assemblages, which are just dotted on the map there. You can see more, sorry. So these are the pots on the screen you can see are from Staple Howe, which is in East Yorkshire. It's a domestic palisaded site occupied between about 700 and 450 BC. And I've measured 132 impressions from 32 potsherds from there. And again, it's the same picture. It's children and women doing it, no adult men. And then the Iron Age, Clay Farm and Linton on the Essex coast. Clay Farm is near Cambridge, Trumpington, and Ivanhoe Beacon were all the same, children and adult women. But at Linton in Cambridgeshire, I did find all ages represented. So it's not a universal picture where men are excluded from pot making. The slightly shiny black sherd at the top there, that is prints which are at least consistent with possibly having been made by adult men. So the broad picture is women and children. Very occasionally men are allowed to stick their thumbs in pots, presumably when there wasn't much else for them to do. And then, as they say, now for something completely different, or at least a very, very different result. So pottery type number 4 is bricotage, and some of the potsherds that I have shown you are fairly dull. This plumbs new depths of uninteresting when you actually look at the potsherds themselves. But the results are really, really cool, I think. So salt itself was a very valuable commodity in later prehistoric times, and indeed afterwards, used for preservation of foodstuffs and also probably for processing animal hides. And bricotage is the debris from that salt extraction process. During the Iron Age, it was extracted from seawater at coastal sites, but also at inland saline springs. So there's some at Droitwich and Middlewich. And you can kind of see the method being illustrated here. So seawater or saline spring water was collected. It was allowed to settle for a little bit in tanks that you can sort of see there, dug into the ground, clay-lined tanks, and that allowed some of the larger impurities to fall out of suspension. And then what was left would be boiled, and the water evaporated and the salt crystals collected. You can see on the screen are what's known as pedestals, and they would support the troughs that you can see in those illustrations, which would, so very sort of flat troughs, which were held up on these pedestal things over open fires to evaporate the brine. And bricotage is, to put it nicely, utilitarian. It was made to fulfill the function of evaporating brine to form salt. A lot of it, particularly these pedestals that you can see here, and also kind of random bits of wet clay used to make running repairs to stabilise the evaporation troughs, appear to have been made sort of as required, kind of squeezed into shape, shoved into place and fired in situ. And because they are not finished in any way, they preserve both finger impressions and fingerprints. So this is just to show you the sites that I've looked at. I looked at 16 middle and late Iron Age saltons from the coast of Essex and Lincolnshire, and one in Norfolk. And these are the sorts of things that you could expect from a Sultan assemblage. So as you can see, it's not, there are glorious artifacts from the Iron Age out there. This is not it, but they are rather cool. What we've got here are examples of pedestals and fire bars. So the inverted triangular things at the top, they are known as fire bars. They come from Essex. That's a slightly different way of that the troughs will sit across the top of them. They'd be apex down with the ends stuck in the side of the fire. Then we've got the pedestals, which would have the troughs balanced on the top of them. The little thing down the bottom that looks like it's making a rude gesture is one of those bits that's randomly stuck in between the troughs to stabilise them as they're wobbling, because you don't really want a wobbly boiling pan of brine falling on your feet. So the manufacture of these things does vary over time. So tempering agents go from being crushed up shells in the earlier part of the Iron Age to chaff is used later on. There's also differences between the process between areas of the country. So Essex does it slightly differently from Lincolnshire. And the manufacture of the briquetage gets cruder over time. We do have salt extraction going as far back as the Neolithic. I did look at bronze, Middle and Late Bronze Age stuff, which was actually pretty well made and smoothed, and therefore didn't preserve any fingerprints. But once you get to the Iron Age, not so much. It's a bit rough and ready, and it preserves lots of things. So here are some of those fingerprints that are preserved on bits of briquetage. And the results were very, very different from the domestic and funerary pottery. They are all consistent with having come from teenage and adult males. So they're all over 0.45 of a millimetre once you rescale for shrinkage. And epidermal ridge dimensions, if you remember the graph from the beginning, reach adult dimensions at around 15 to 16 years old. And 95% of all of the fingerprints that I measured were from teenage males aged 15, 16, above, or adult males. I had one possible print from a 12-year-old, and that was it. There was none from anybody that was younger, and with the exception of the 12-year-old that could arguably be one print, could arguably be a woman, there was none that were narrow enough to come from women, which would suggest that there's a real age and gender exclusive community of practice involved in salt extraction. Or rather, what I can say is involved in briquetage making. You might then extend it to say salt extraction, which I think is probably realistic. And it's a diametrically opposed community of practice to those who are making the pots that we looked at with the fingerprints on, fingertip impressions on. So if you assume that the pedestals and the supports for the troughs were made in situ at the Sultans, it seems that we've got this sort of manufacture of briquetage, which is, when people have looked at the consistency of the briquetage, it's made from local clay to the site. It's not being brought in from miles away. So it's probably the briquetage, and by extension the operation of the salt making process is carried out by late teenage and adult men to the exclusion of other members of the community. So potentially they're forming a closed community of practice with limited access to it. And maybe, one can hypothesize, maybe becoming a salt maker or being allowed to go out to make salt was maybe a rite of passage for young men in the Iron Age. That's a whole other hypothesis that I can't prove, but it seems strange that it is only men that do it. And the suggestion is that salt extraction happens, certainly coastal salt extraction, at the end of the summer, both because you get chaff used as a tempering agent, which is a byproduct of the harvest, and also because you need kind of, a bit of solar evaporation to help the process. It's really not much fun going off into the salt marshes at the end of the summer to make the salt, man-make salt, which makes an interesting contrast to what we know is going on at the Hallstatt salt mines at the same time. So there you've got men, women and children all involved in salt mining. Here, salt boiling from coastal sites, just the men. So to sum up, it seems that from the finger impression analysis that potters making domestic and funerary wares were women and children. But during the Middle and Late Iron Age, the form of pottery with, shall we say, less artistic merit, very utilitarian, was made by teenage and adult males. And teenagers were probably culturally adult at this point anyway. Life was a bit shorter and teenagers were reproducing younger. So by the time you're 15 or 16, you're probably an adult. And we've got two very distinct communities of practice involved in different types of pottery manufacturing. So even though these pot sherds that I've been showing you are not as exciting as other finds from the period, they do at least give us a glimpse of people behind the artifact. Now, you told me, Brandon, I have to minimise it, don't you, to get the chat up.
So what we'll have is questions now, please.
No, what have I done?
There we go. So for those of you at home, you're very welcome to pose your own questions too. Like I said, type a question into the chat and we'll read it out, or you can use the raise hand feature. We're open up to questions. So.
Please just talk to me.
Thank you. That was a really, really interesting presentation. I very much enjoyed that. I have an interesting childhood too, but I don't have data like this, since it's really interesting to me. I was wondering about the last results that you showed, which are obviously very striking, and I wondered if you want to develop further. If you want to develop further, what the implications are for gendered labor division and or broader gender systems. This does imply, for instance, in your Iron Age material then, that there is a binary gender system based on biological sex, do you think?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I really want to expand it, because I've looked just at Lincolnshire and Essex, which is obviously quite localised. There is, it does vary over time. So, if I look at one site, I can say we've got sort of, everybody here is male. Another site, it might be 92%. I think to build on it, I need to, I'd love to look at the inland material, see if it's the same. I'd love to look at, coastal sites from Europe where we know they're, and indeed the inland sites from Europe where they're extracting salt as well, to kind of bring that broad picture. It's at the moment, I think we can say that at certain times of the year, at the end of the summer, men went off to the salt marshes and made salt and then brought it back, and it was that, we know it was then traded. There's been been done with the inland sites, so we know it's going around the country, at least from the inland sites. But I think we can say that is gendered, and I think the gender biological sex thing is quite different. All I can say is that is a fingerprint that is made by somebody whose biological sex is male. As for how that interprets to gender in the archaeological record, you can't really tell what their gender identity was. You can tell what their biological sex is from a fingerprint. But it's, I think it would make sense if we've got, this is a task that men do. They go out, and then at home we've got, it seems, in a domestic setting, we've got women and children making pots. There was, studies. There's a chap called Peacock who did some studies on modes of production, and he said that when you're doing production for a household level, it's the preserve of women. When you get to an industrial level and it's all being traded, then men do that. And he was talking about pottery, and he based it on ethnography, and I didn't like it. I thought, why the hell shouldn't women be doing industrial production? But sadly, it seems that he might have been right, which is a little bit annoying. So I think it's the beginning of something that we could say it needs more work. It's a thesis that's looked at some data, but I think to develop it, it needs more data, and then we can begin to say, well, does this actually apply more widely? Widen out the study area, and then you might be able to kind of tease out some hypotheses about whether or not we've got true gendering. Are little girls becoming potters, and do little boys go off and make salt? And then and I'd love to do it with metalwork, but how you do it beyond looking at the ceramic moulds for some of the metalwork. But was it were the men the smiths, or were the women the smiths, or could anybody be a smith? So it'd be lovely to try and extend it to other craft and art materials to see what can be done, because it feels like it's the beginning of something, but there's a postdoc in there somewhere, she said, hopefully.
Yeah, I was fascinated by your use of kind of aesthetic judgments there, because it's impossible to escape, isn't it? If you look at these, you can't stop yourself.
I've looked at so much bricolage, it really isn't pretty.
But I was also reminded of something that stuck in my head ever since I read it. I'll dictate it word for word. But it's by J.N.L. Myers, who was the doyen of Anglo-Saxon pottery descriptions, classify things into all sorts of shapes and forms and stuff like that. And I remember it goes along the lines of some of these pots are really crude and coarse and obviously fired by incompetent housewives, whereas others fine. Who travelled around from place to place on multiple functions and to eat. And that structure was so kind of deep in his head, he couldn't imagine it in any other way.
It does sound a bit like Peacock's modes of production. As soon as it gets classy, men have to do it, which is just odd. But another thing that I think will be worth developing is looking at skill level. So it has been done a bit. Sandy Budden looked at some Bronze Age pots and looked at, when they're a bit wonky, or when the clay is unevenly thick in the walls, or when the decoration's a bit off. But again, that's a judgment. We're looking at it from what would we expect a perfectly formed pot to be, and could we say that's been made by an adult? And if you've got a wonky one, is that made by a child, or is it just an adult learner? Because an apprentice potter doesn't need to be a child. They could be an adult who's coming to it late in life because they've given up making gold torques or swords or something. If their eyesight's shot, they're going to go and make it pots instead. But I think I'd love to have a look at sort of the skill level side of things, and link that to see whether the fingerprints or the finger impressions bring it in, to see if we can see a pattern building of whether making small pots, or do they then graduate onto making medium-sized pots, and when do you get to make a middle Bronze Age urn that's this big? Because you've got to be physically strong enough to hold the thing and understand that if you make the clay too thin, it's all going to collapse. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done around skill levels and age and who's involved, and at what point they get involved, and what point they can do different parts of the process. Because anybody can go and sort of collect some clay from the ground, and then it has to be sort of treated before you can make it into a pot. But I think there's there's a question coming up, but linking skill to it. But then this idea of when it's an itinerant and skilled maker of domestic pots is men. Well, that seems not to be the case. It seems that by and large pots, and one would assume therefore if the rusticated beakers are being made by women and children, why the hell shouldn't they be making the pretty ones with all the nice geometric designs on as well? So there's more work to be done.
I'd like to move on to these questions from our...
Oh, you need to scroll down.
We have one up here as well from Zoe Scofield.
Right, can you tell if the children... the answer, Zoe, is no. You can't. You can't tell with kids, with sub-adults below about 15. You cannot tell whether it's male or female child. The sexual dimorphism appears later on. So with children, sadly, unless they happen to, leave a bit of DNA or something in there, we can't, from fingertips and fingerprints, you cannot tell whether it's a boy or a girl. Only when you get to adults. So sorry about that. Came across examples of children and adult fingerprints overlapping. Oh, that's interesting. I made a point of measuring kind of ones that were clear. So I suppose that would be a thing to have a look at. I went with the pots. I went. Okay, there's a clear one, I can measure that, and there's another one, a clear one, I can measure that, and spend a lot of time with digital calipers and measuring things and trying to work out which way the finger had been applied. But there must be kind of a real starting point where somebody is saying, okay, so we're looking for nice linear pattern, nice lines on this pot, and this is how you do it, and guiding their fingers. So that would be a wonderful thing about how you would find evidence of, mum putting. Now you have to go at making straight lines yourself, and then you get some of the examples of the kind of wibbly wobbly all over thing, and then you can imagine going, yeah, that's lovely. Should we try again with the next pot? But it's I haven't found anywhere you've got two together, or rather I made a point of not measuring ones that were unclear, because what I wanted was clear data that told me who was decorating them. So or kind of parents or adult carers guiding the hands of small children in order to help them with their skill development. I'm just going to scroll down this. I think in terms of telling the story, I think that the best ones were the big Middle Bronze Age bucket urns, where you've got different ages of people working on the same pot, and you can kind of build a story around that. You could sort of see that you've got areas of the pot where children have been allowed to decorate it, or encouraged to decorate it, or just told to get on with decorating it. Meanwhile, the skill of putting on those kind of horseshoe-shaped skeuomorphic rope style handles. That's not being entrusted to smaller people. That's the fingers that are putting those on to make that sort of rope-like design. Those are wide. Those are the sort of adult women's fingertips. So you do get these little stories, and it's hard to, you know, well, you kind of get carried away and you sort of see, oh, look, there's somebody's fingerprints and they're 5, or finger impressions, they're 5, and there's an adult, and you can kind of recreate that story, but then that's probably not very academic, is it, to try and sort of story build around it, although it is rather tempting when you can kind of see this evidence of people working together. But, one shouldn't get carried away with building stories, because that doesn't get you publications. One has to be academic and scientific about it. I'm looking at ridges on pottery. Did you include prints that were overlapped? Stretch prints I didn't measure. Ones which were overlapped, what I did, so if you've got you're looking at the fingerprints themselves on brickage, they do overlap, because you find bits where if you pick up a lump of clay and you're trying to form it into some sort of pedestal thing, you do end up with overlapping prints. What I do in terms of photographing them, you have to look very closely. You need your raking light across the surface of the thing, photograph them, but I want something that's clear. If they're overlapping, if there's a bit of the ridge of the print that's clear, I can measure it. If we've got another fingerprint coming in a different way, then as long as you know which bit you're measuring, it's measurable. But if they're overlapping, it doesn't stop you measuring them, as long as it doesn't smudge or stretched. But if they were in any way distorted, I didn't measure them, because it's not going to give an accurate result. What you want with a fingerprint, much the way as what you want with a fingertip impression, is something that's pretty much gone down straight. If you're doing this across the surface, they don't get preserved. If you're sort of moving a hand around, they get smudged. You often find things that look like fingerprints, but are in fact where the suction of the moisture in the clay kind of raises up, and it almost looks like veins in the clay. It's quite spooky looking, but that's not a fingerprint. You need a clear pattern of those epidermal ridges in the clay. So smudged and stretched, not measured. Overlapped, you can measure, as long as the print itself is clear. Is hand growth trajectory proportional to that of stature? Yes, essentially. I mean, apart from the pubertal growth spurt, which makes everybody go, bits of you grow at different rates. Generally speaking, there is a sort of a gentle curve. Everything sort of, I mean, we don't all grow, you know, isotropically at exactly the same rate with everything growing, but generally speaking, hand growth does grow proportionally with stature. Apart from around the age of 12 when it all goes completely wrong, but then they calm down again. Is that all the questions on there? I think so.
I might ask you, maybe kind of a lead question, but did you ever end up seeing or is looking for the same fingerprint more than once, especially on the pots where there are so many?
Yeah, it would really only work with the fingerprints on the brickage, because the fingertip impressions, although you can sort of imagine going, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, there's a lot of them are so similar that you can say, oh, that must be somebody who's gone, here's my line, turn the pot round, here's my line. And it makes sense that it's somebody turning a pot round and sticking the same print in. With the pedestals and the brickage, it's really tempting to look for that sort of those, get a bit forensic and do the sort of crime detection. Is this the same person? And logically, if it's just one person who's picked something up and squeezing it into place, you're putting it into place over an already burning fire. The pan is, or the trough with the boiling water in, is going to be hot. It's going to be probably going to be one person squeezing it in, jamming it into place. It's not going to be passed. Although you can't prove it, I think what we've got on the pedestal is going to be made by one person. I would have to then sort of go back and try and find those characteristic minutiae in a sort of forensic way, which is what I didn't do that because I wanted to look for sort of overall demographic results to say, yeah, have we got kids doing this? Have we got women doing this? But it will be possible, I think. You have to spend a lot of time in the stores in Lincoln to do it. I mean, it's being done on some Mediterranean material, where you've got known workshop sites, and see if you've actually got, this is sort of the stamp of a master potter here, and this is, you know, somebody else's fingerprint on this one. But the brick art and salt and sites are not really pottery workshop. You know, it's kind of being made full of salt, boil the pan, and you know, and take the salt out, and off we go. So it's a slightly different sort of setup rather than the kind of very groovy stuff that you get in the Mediterranean, where it's presentable. We've got another one coming up. We've got to leave the room in 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, we can go one or two over that. While her question's coming up, can I ask, just because your methodology was so thorough, I was quite impressed actually. You kind of looked at Bronze Age and Iron Age, but not Neolithic. Is that just because the
just because I could keep going. I'd love to go back to Neolithic. Sure. It was a choice. I've also looked at burials and gathered 3,205 burials, all of sites with kids involved through the Bronze and Iron Ages. If I'd gone back to Neolithic as well, I would never have finished. It took me 5 years to finish the thing anyway. So I kind of had to, you know, I needed a study area, so I've looked at Eastern England, 12 counties worth of data, and I needed a temporal spread, so Bronze and Iron Age. But there is no reason why it couldn't be applied earlier. You just need to look at how tall they were in the Neolithic period and scale the modern reference data back, and it would work just. I don't think you can say it's a 13-year-old boy. You can't be that precise with it. But most who can probably say that yes, you can. But it would be an interesting discussion to have. But yeah, there's absolutely no reason why I shouldn't do the Neolithic as well. Or go forward in time as well. We'll look at the Romans. And Laura's still typing.
Yeah, we'll give her another minute.
There we go. What did I do? Oh, yes, I could do. I'd probably need some funding to and speak to somebody in police departments to do that, because it would be lovely to build a little archaeological database, wouldn't it, of salt workers. You'd have to be very clear on the dating of them, so that, you know, but yeah, that would be really cool. Cool. Can you imagine? It would be like sort of, you know, CSI Sultans or something. That would be quite fun.
Yeah, okay. Unless someone wants to squeeze in last question, we'll after this head over to the Marquee Wellington, and you're welcome to join us. Before